Pemberton Greenish breakout room on building Kent back to growth. Firstly, thank you. We were worried we would be talking to ourselves as there's no breakfast on offer this year. You'll be pleased to hear that we are going to keep it light and interactive. It's not a presentation, so please do send in any questions during the discussions and we will try and incorporate them into the conversation, time permitting. You can do this by using the chat button. As time is short, we're also more than happy to discuss any questions we don't have time for after the event. I'd like to introduce the panel. Jason Towell, our Head of Planning. Do you want to wave, Jason?
Morning.
He's pretty well known to a number of you. Glenn Miller, who heads up our house builder team, and not only obviously is he a legal expert, but he obviously from his time in-house at National House Builder brings commercial insight to this. Liz Carter from our real estate business development team is behind the scenes. I blame Liz for making us do this this morning, so thank you, Liz. Liz will be moderating the chat and collating any questions. So please do use the chat function to discuss amongst yourselves and create an off-screen debate if that's helpful. I'm Richard Blackman. I'll be moderating the conversation today as well as commentating, and I specialise in property development and property finance. It's great to see so many people in the room today, a real mixture of local authority, developers, property professionals and others. Hopefully this will mean we generate really interesting questions and debate. Depending on your chat, we can cut some of what we originally were going to discuss and instead focus on what the room wants to talk about. So what could possibly go wrong? No pressure. I'd like to just say a quick thank you to all those who applied to our pre-event poll and sent some questions in, so thank you. If you want to, you can still respond after the session. Now, building Kent back to growth is a huge topic, and as with so much of development in Kent, it's Resi-led. The key is increasing the number of new starts and improving affordability. And with that in mind, we will discuss what risks and opportunities await under the current proposals, such as the Planning White Paper, Planning for the Future, and Transparency and Competition in Land Control, and what these changes may pose to regional developers, especially SMEs and local authorities, and we will weave in practical market issues as we see them. As time is marching on, let's put the first question to the panel. Jason, will the proposed legislative changes, if implemented, create the step change needed to give developers the opportunities and confidence to increase new house starts?
I think, well, first of all, a morning to everybody, but I'd just like to point out that planning goes through constant changes. I've worked in planning over 25 years, and I counted at least 5 major substantial changes to the planning system. And, we need to be sure that these proposals together create a substantial amount of change again. Will they create benefits, or does the change just cause disruption and lack of certainty to landowners, developers, and whole new skill sets to be learnt by local authorities? And I think also all the substantial changes in the past, if they've taught us anything, they are that constant changing of the planning system alone cannot develop the step change increase in housing numbers that the council is still looking, that the government is still looking to create.
Thank you, Jason. I mean, if we just pick a few of the key features of the paper, maybe starting with the infrastructure levy. So, why will the proposed infrastructure levy work when planning gain supplement never got off the ground and previous development land taxes hampered development?
Yes, I mean, it's called an infrastructure levy, and it will replace community infrastructure levy and Section 106 agreements. It's not badged a development land tax, but that is what it amounts to. So it is raising a charge on increasing land value above a certain threshold. And there's some initial concerns with it. First one is that previous attempts at bringing in a development land tax, if you go as far back as sort of the 70s, that all that managed to do was actually quash and result in a drastic reduction in land tax. Sorry, a drastic reduction in development activity, in fact. The other one is that with a national set of, or national thresholds, there is a risk that what you may end up with is that you only end up with development in the most viable areas, and the most viable areas are in the southern parts of the country. Now that might be good, and the more homes built there improves affordability, but the flip side of that is it runs counter to the government's levelling up agenda between the north and south of the country. And again, if we look at the county of Kent, viabilities tend to be much better towards the middle and towards the west of the county than they are to the east. Yet, you know, there are great opportunities to the east of the county, but if viability doesn't stack up, and if that is harmed by infrastructure levy, then that could be a problem.
It almost has the opposite effect than what's intended.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And there are also concerns, looking at it through a planning lawyer's eyes, about if you do away with 106 agreements, then there are large elements of infrastructure that are delivered by 106 agreements that are on-site delivery. For example, provision of schools on-site, ecological areas, medical centres, community areas, those kinds of things will be harder to deal with if you only have a financial instrument, the infrastructure levy.
Jason, couldn't that be dealt with by planning condition?
It couldn't, unless you change, which is not referred to in the white paper. You'd need to change policy and guidance into how conditions can be used. Under the present regime, you couldn't deliver some elements of those infrastructure by planning condition alone.
But it would be possible to deal with it with infrastructure levy and planning condition if they were going to go down the infrastructure levy route.
I think you would be able to deal with the vast majority of those elements. There's still elements that are contained within Section 106 agreements. For example, setting out terms of land transfers and those types of issues where you want certainty of the terms of a land transfer. I can't see how you would really deal with those by way of planning condition.
I mean, Glenn, what do you think it might do to land prices?
Well, I mean, you know, going back, I mean, from a a land lawyer's point of view, my concern is, you know, what Jason expressed at the beginning, that more change is just going to create uncertainty and delay in getting skilled up on this process. But I think my biggest issue with the infrastructure levy proposals are the viability. You know, it's a levy by reference to development viability, and it's not clear the point at which that levy crystallizes. But from my point of view, you know, most of the Section 106, you know, there's been so much, you know, delay with Section 106s in this dark art of viability negotiation to open a levy up to a much wider development value viability argument with the local authority. I think it's going to cause much more risk in the development market. I mean, it does open up an element of risk depending on where it's going to be crystallized. We need to make sure that that risk is factored into and properly understood before any land contracts crystallize and before developers buy their site. And also understand how it's going to, how it's going to be mitigated if there's downturns in the market. Now, at the moment, that's completely unclear, but all we do know from experience is that viability is a massive issue in the Section 106 negotiation process. To flip it all into an infrastructure levy, which is purely based on development viability, I just think it's going to create more delay, create more risk, and I just think it will actually slow up development at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you for that, Glenn. Jason, you know, why will a simplified and speedier local plan process and the return to government top-down housing numbers be good for new house starts and will provide greater certainty and should assist delivery?
Again, local plans currently can take literally years and sometimes years and years to progress. And the government is looking through the white paper to have a local plan process where it takes 30 months to bring in a local plan, which does seem quick, and whether that will be possible remains to be seen. The what they are seeking to do in terms of housing numbers is to provide top-down numbers. So this is a bit like Back to the Future. So this is, in effect, going back to what the planning system was before we had the current system of local development frameworks, the MPPF, 5-year housing land supply being established. Currently at local plans, establishing housing need and requirements takes up a considerable amount of time, controversy and debate. The intention is that the government will set the numbers. This will also potentially remove the need for what's called the duty to cooperate, which is in effect, under the current system, an attempt to ensure that where areas cannot provide housing because of constraints such as greenbelt, then they are provided on adjoining authorities. And really that element would be dictated to by government. It's similar to the position we had with regional strategies setting housing numbers.
Did it work before?
Well, this is it. This is why I keep my opening comments were about, we keep changing the system, we go from one to another, and does it actually result in the step change increase? I'm not sure it does.
I mean, from a land perspective, the market's got to be there. There's no point in driving numbers in a region if the viability and the financial, if the model doesn't stack, then you're not going to have anybody building. So,
and kind of linked with that, really, do we have enough people and the right people with the right skill sets, both in the public and private sector, to actually, increase the number of house starts?
I think this is an element of where, whenever you change the system, people have to adapt to that system and develop the skill set. Local authorities at the moment, through no fault of their own, but through lack of funding, are stretched in terms of resource issues anyway. And there's a lot in the planning white paper which I could go talk about at length, but won't do. For example, things like there's much more emphasis on design and quality of design and designing for beauty. And the assessment of that is a different, not a totally different skill set, but what the route the government is going, for example, seeking design codes at a much more sub-district level, there's a lot more work involved in that. So there's a simple resource and whether there is the skill set.
Thank you. I mean, what we haven't really touched on so far is what things might benefit SMEs with the proposed changes. So looking now at the changes to the number of units before we have to provide affordable housing units, do you think, raising the threshold to 50, Glenn, is going to help SMEs?
Yeah, I mean, instinctually you'd say it would, because the sub 50 sites have always been the kind of domain, or certainly in the last 10 years have been the domain of SMEs, the reason why is because the national house builders haven't been interested in that space because you don't get the economies of scale. The problem with the SME market has always, over the last 10 years, has always been finance and affordability, and the requirement for affordable housing on a number of schemes has caused a major problems in terms of viability, but also where a site is viable on paper. I mean, I've certainly experienced a number of sites over the last 5 years where, a site works on paper, you've got the affordable housing provision, you've got an SME in that space, but there isn't actually an end buyer for the Section 106 product. Because, by virtue of the nature of the site, the size of the site, the location of the site, rural fringes and whatever, again, the registered providers, there hasn't been a registered provider market to buy into that Section 106 provision, because again, they look for the larger sites and economies of scale and management process, etc. So I think removing that is certainly going to free up some of the sites that have had difficulties over the last years. It's certainly going to allow, I think it's going to free up investment in that space. It's going to make it a bit more competitive. I think the counter argument is it going to make it so competitive that it becomes a space which the nationals start to creep back into? But at the end of the day, it is an area, where we need both in Kent and as a country as a whole, to increase development, because it's that kind of market that was always, has 30 years ago, provided a third of the numbers. Now we're down to whatever 10-12%.
Sorry, Jason, what are you trying to say?
Running a counter argument to Glenn is or as part of the debate is really, but the concern must be that it will result in less affordable housing units being built, because there are a large number, whether in Kent or elsewhere in the country, of sites that are less than 50 units, and therefore if they don't have to deliver affordable housing, there will be less affordable housing delivered.
And potentially in places where it's really needed, such more rural areas. I mean, from my sort of development finance sort of hat on, I'm finding at the moment that there's a real problem with finding people to take on the sort of current affordable housing units because of viability issues and concerns about price of shared ownership units and that kind of stuff. And that's really holding up some of the schemes we're working on at the moment, because can't get the scheme away. I
mean, that's interesting, because we're doing a lot of variation. We're varying a lot of 106 agreements, playing around and changing tenures as the registered providers adapt to the change in what is needed to be delivered.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. Glenn, you got a thought on that?
Well, no. Other than that is the natural. That's the natural result of having a scheme where it's a tough market to properly finance. So, I think I personally think the proposals are quite positive in that regard, because I think it's the SME market that is going to fill the numbers over the next 5 years. We can't rely purely on the nationals. They've had 10 years to do it, and they've just not filled that space. You're not going to compete with sites in the same area. There is a business driver that underlines all this, and we just need more competition in the market to bring the numbers up in Kent.
Yeah, as time's moving on, better go on to the next question, really, Glenn. As you know, we've recently had discussions with clients and carried out an online survey regarding the transparency and competition in land control proposals. Could you explain briefly what is proposed and whether you think it will do what it says on the tin?
Well, this is a government consultation paper where the responses were sought for the end of last month. And what the government is essentially doing is looking for full transparency to be registered on the land registry of commercial contracts between landowner and developer or promoter. And the government driver behind this, their thinking is not clear, and that's evidenced really by the questions they were putting out in the consultation. But nevertheless, it's worrying because it was pretty wide sweeping in terms of its aim of looking for full transparency. And what they're really looking to do is they're really looking to have that full transparency because they believe that there is a lack of understanding in local communities about likely paths of development. And they also think that the market is being monopolised by the big players at the moment, and there's lack of competition for the smaller players. And they think that full transparency is going to open that up. But I've got some big concerns about this, and we've run a few sessions with clients and other players in the development game, because development is a inherently risky business, which is why it's difficult to get finance, and which is why there's only a select number of players. We've got planning risk, development risk, market risk, and negotiating development deals, certainly on strategic development deals, takes time. It needs to take into account title constraints. You carefully need to meander around covenants, potential ransoms, sensitive price negotiations with land assemblies, where you're looking at existing use brownfield sites that are coming forward for strategic redevelopment. You've got, where they're operational, you've got customers, you've got supply chain, you've got employees. All of the sensitive negotiations and discrete negotiations that go on in the background between owner and developer need to stay discreet, in my view, because I think it's going to stop people coming to market. it's going to stop the brownfield sites, the operational sites coming to market if there is a requirement for disclosure. And I think it's also going to start driving up the land prices where, you know, where we're looking at competing areas and you're looking at land assembly. So, I mean, I've got some real concerns about a disclosure, and certainly from the survey we did, a number of our clients and the agents in the market have also got similar concerns.
Thank you. I mean, Jason, do you think there's another way that some of the perhaps better parts of this could be achieved, maybe through the local plan or something?
Yes, and it's interesting that the land transparency paper consultation ran alongside the planning white paper, and the government cross-refers in effect in the white paper and sees it's all about data and access to information, so that to establish that people can see the potential sites coming forward for development, which, yes, maybe that does allow access to SMEs into that market, but of course it may enable people to take measures to prevent development coming forward armed with that knowledge at a much earlier stage before the site has evolved. I believe there's enough information for local authorities already as part of the local plan process in terms of when sites come forward, establishing the deliverability of those sites is an important element. So I don't believe that the measures set out in the land transparency are essential for the planning process.
No, thank you, Jason.
I mean, so just on that, Richard, actually, it does, what government seems to forget here is that it is dependent upon somebody wanting to sell their land. So, just because you have a contract in place, doesn't mean all the metrics are going to be met and that a sale is going to happen. So, by having full disclosure of information on a land registry is not a guarantee of delivery, as we all know with the contracts that have never come to fruition.
Absolutely. And I'm just going to actually interrupt you guys, because we've had a question in. So first of all, if anyone else wants to put a question in, please do. But a big thank you to Justin. Justin's question is, how do the funds from the levy translate to investment in local roads, and who decides where these roads go? Who coordinated and where they spend the levy? I don't know if there's anyone out there who actually wants to answer that question before.
I can, unless are you opening it out much more?
Well, I was trying to open that first, but I don't know whether people want to engage first or no. I don't put anyone on the spot, but if somebody does, I'll give a minute for someone to say something.
Go on, Jason.
Okay. So, I mean, this is a concern around the levy in that the beauty of 106 agreements is that there's a direct connection between the development. So it's a great question, because it's an element I wanted to bring out earlier, that 106 agreements have this connection between what goes on is delivered on site. So, for example, if you're contributing to a school, it has to be a local school, or if you're contributing to traffic speed reduction measures, that's all local, or highways capacity, it's all local through the 106 agreement. And there remains a concern on the infrastructure levy, as set out in the white paper, that could go into infrastructure and used on infrastructure that is not directly related to development. So that has two consequences. For the developer, it means they're paying for elements that don't actually benefit the marketability of their site. And for locals, they can't see the benefits coming forward from their development. Whereas at least with the 106 agreement, they can say, okay, we've taken on board those 200 houses, but we have a nice shiny.
Well, there's a danger. It can be used as a political pot of cash, isn't it?
Yeah.
And absolutely. How does that work with the principle of sustainability then?
Well, this is it, and there's planning has all these competing interests and competing angles, but yes, I mean that is where the concerns about a purely financial levy can't deliver the elements of on-site infrastructure that are necessary to make the development sustainable.
So what's the answer?
I believe the answer is to retain Section 106 agreements or something akin to them. If the government is looking for a financial, looking to recover money from what they see as vast house builder profits and landowner windfall profits. You could have a combination of the both. So you could have a much smaller element of infrastructure levy to recover that, to assist more general regional infrastructure, but retaining 106 agreements for the on-site elements to ensure the development is sustainable. That might be one route, i.e. a blend. And that is in effect what happened when we had planning gain supplement was proposed, I think it's about 10 years ago or something like that. You know, that was going to replace 106 agreements. And what we ended up with was a bit of a halfway house of community infrastructure levy and Section 106 agreements. The difficulty with that, and the one bit of the infrastructure levy I do like, is the doing away with SIL, because SIL, the community infrastructure levy, has become hugely overcomplicated. And what should have been just writing a check has become far more than that.
I mean, but this comes back to this. Sorry, this comes back to your intro, Jason, which was about the changes in the planning system. From an investment point of view, and this applies from landowners as well. When wanting to put large strategic sites forward, you need that certainty of market and system. To know where you stand, because otherwise you just get landowners sitting back, as you do when in any kind of political turbulence, sitting back and saying, well, I'm not putting it forward now because I might get hit by that big windfall. You need that kind of certainty to ensure ongoing supply.
Well, we're seeing that sort of nervousness about transition is actually happening already. Yeah. In the light of the white paper, with a couple of local authorities seeming to be pausing the progression of their local plans because of concern that, or rather to ensure that they believe in the new system world, they will be in a better position in that they won't have to, for example, to deliver so much housing.
Great. There were a few questions that were put in through the poll we obviously sent out a couple of days ago. So I just want to quickly raise a couple of those, if that's okay. One was, how can the planning system be streamlined and reduce costs while maintaining standards? You've got 30 seconds, Jason.
This is the big question. Really, I think it is resourcing of local authorities. The current system works if it has proper resource to enable local authorities to deal with issues in a timely manner, which they have insufficient resource at present. And yes, some elements of this white paper which are good, which perhaps we haven't had an opportunity to go at length this morning, but don't seek to deal with or change the planning system from the bottom up, if you like, but smaller tweaks to refine the system, because the core system works. It just needs for it to be a stable system rather than the constant changing. That's
very, very true. Very, very true. So with that in mind, how can the decisions be made faster?
In terms of faster decisions, the white paper actually is talking about much more emphasis on the local plan and all of the decisions. We haven't spoken about the sort of zoning of growth, renewal and protect zones in local plans, but the aim is a much speedier system there with, for example, growth areas amounting to an outline planning permission at the start. And what the white paper talks about is where decisions do have to be taken by councils, far more of those to be decided by planning officers under delegated authority. So you'll see less determined by planning committees. So that will speed the process up. But of course, there's a counter element to that, is that at the expense of democracy?
True. So it seems to me that what you've been really saying is that local authorities are really important in helping building Kent back to growth.
Definitely.
Going forward, as well as obviously developers having the confidence to start, and landowners putting their land kind of forward, really. So,
Jason, just following on that actually, because we've had a question from Graham asking about the growth areas and essentially going back to the old school days of putting a red line round a plan and rubber stamping your permission. And I think his question was, is that just going to open up the floodgates for, cowboy developers?
No, I don't think it does, because at the end of the day, the growth area designation, which I believe only local authorities will only use where they're looking for large, strategic, sustainable urban extensions or new communities, in fact, will be any areas where you'll see these growth areas identified. But there's still, you would have an outline planning permission, but you'd still need to go through a further process before a developer, if it was a cowboy or even if it wasn't a cowboy, could develop. So, for example, through reserve matters approval would be required, and that's where the detail, and that is how local authorities will be able to ensure quality is a quality development, and again, much more emphasis about design and beauty in the white paper.
Do you think there's going to be a reluctance for local authorities to commit to growth areas if they don't have the necessary assurances on some of the strategic infrastructure that is needed to deliver those communities?
Well, this is it again.
Coming back to the infrastructure levy and the fact they need to talk to each other, don't they? Essentially, because
yeah,
and that detail's not there at the moment, is it? I mean, that's that's where the devil's going to be.
Yeah, very much so.
I mean, and Glenn, why is it important that SMEs get more opportunities? What's the difference when an SME builds something compared to a national?
Well, I mean, SMEs are really important to the local economy. I mean, ultimately your supply chain stays local, and I think for every £1 spent, I think the data shows that, you get £2.20 odd back into your local economy. So, I mean, that does apply with the nationals as well. You're generally local trade, but I mean, certainly in terms of your supply chains, where the SMEs are more predominantly local, it is going to have a massive benefit for Kent and other regions. And as I said before, the nationals are just not going to fill the numbers on their own. You're going to need that SME market to get that sense of competition, to get that quality in the market. And actually, the focus should quite rightly be there. I mean, the focus, Jason was talking about, the white paper the planning white paper nods to design.
Probably more than nods. It's quite emphasised.
Well, precisely. And that's where you need the competition in the market to be able to, step up to that. So, SMEs are critical to the market. That was evidenced 30 years ago. There's been the decline since since 2008 because of finance and everything else. But I think that's where the government are looking to focus. I'm just not entirely sure that they're ticking all the right boxes. But as I say, there's so much detail that's missing at the moment. It really is a scrabble to the market for information. So, anyone who's involved in the game and has a thought on this would be advised to submit their thoughts, because it is all being pulled together at a massive, at a great speed here.
And just trying to bring this back to the sort of the Kent focus, really. So where do we think the opportunities might be in Kent over the next couple of years, and why?
Oh, that's
what's happening fairly soon?
Well, we're in turbulent times.
Positive.
Well, Kent, I mean, the geography of Kent is always its advantage, and that's got to stand us in good stead. But we're in funny times. We certainly, as a county, will need support to ensure growth. We're in turbulent times. Obviously, the COVID, obviously Brexit on just on the horizon. Development finance, as you know from your markets, is still largely restricted to the established players. And I think that needs to open up. We need some, and I think we're going to see more opportunity opening up with joint ventures with local authorities. There is a drive, there is a focus on using local authority land and investment and forward funding to start bringing forward, the delivery of local authority land. I think that can only happen with a good joint venture arrangement to get the skill set into the market, to get it, to de-risk it in the market. So I think there are some really good opportunities. We've got some local authorities that are are quite opportunist and I think optimistic for growth. So I think there are some really good opportunities, but we've got a huge, hill ahead of us.
Yeah,
as has the rest of the country.
Yeah. So really, what we're saying is, we want to see local authorities building more, back to how things were in the past, perhaps, which is interesting.
Well, they had greater stock to be able to do so in the past. So I don't think you're going to see an appetite for local authorities to, But Jason and I have spoken about this in the past. Where sites need to unblock, and this really is. Homes England have come into their own over the last 5 years, with the change of the remit and investment in some of the strategic sites to unlock those that just weren't working because of, high infrastructure, upfront infrastructure costs and viability issues. So that, I think you're going to see Homes England playing, an ever increasing role, and that can only be a good thing.
And you could see a greater role by local authorities, but through the use of their compulsory purchase powers. Yeah. We've seen that in some areas within Kent, but I think it would be used far more if the compulsory purchase regime was far more straightforward and quicker and a simpler process, which is something the government has been looking at for a long time. But it does need to happen, and then local authorities will have more confidence and enthusiasm to bring forward development using their compulsory purchase powers.
No, true. Interesting. Now, I think you talked there about Homes England, because I think actually the Kent Developers Group has sort of raised that as a point. It's great that they're coming and funding more, but there's been some concerns about the time it takes to actually get the funding in place. So whether there's anything that they can actually do to sort of speed that process up. Even though I think the idea that saying the private sector finances quick is not true either. Everyone wants to make sure things are done properly. So I'm quite conscious of time because the main event starts in about 7 minutes, I think. And don't know about you, but I'm sure a number of people probably want to go off and get a coffee and maybe a comfort break. So I just want to quickly sort of summarise and say thank you, Jason. Thank you, Glenn, for your comments. Thank you for those who did put a question or two in. Would have liked a bit more interaction perhaps with everyone, but I can understand it's early in the morning and people don't necessarily want to open their mouth. But maybe this is something that we can take kind of forward and offline going forward. So we will have a look at all the questions that have come in and sort of follow up on this. And maybe there's something as a group we can do and continue after this session, because what's absolutely clear is that neither the private sector on their own nor the public sector on their own can really achieve what's really needed, which is an increase in new starts and development generally. It needs a combination of both the private and the public sector, as well as property professionals, all trying to push things along. And there are strong headwinds that aren't helping. But if everyone pulls together, we can achieve what we want to do and build Kent back to growth. So I hope it's been useful for everyone this morning. As always, time just rushes, and I can't believe it's been 40 minutes and we've only got through half the questions we actually were going to talk about. So just want to say thank you, enjoy the morning, and hope to see you soon.